Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I'm Angela Walters and I'm going live every Thursday to talk about quilting or something quilting related. If you joined me last week, it looked a little different because I was actually at the shop. It was a quick live chat. I was like, oh my gosh, I finished that so fast. But I'm back in my studio, back with content, so this is more like a normal live chat. So in this chat, we're going to talk about ideas for picking quilting designs for your sampler quilts. And we'll talk about that in a second, but just a real quick update about the challenge. So those of you that have been asking about the free motion challenge quilting along, it's coming. We're just waiting on fabric. It should be here any day. So I do have a sneak peek. I threw a picture in at the end of the slideshow so that I could give you a little sneak peek. And also I'll be showing you 3 new fabric collections I designed for our next Build a Quilt block of the month. So lots of like sneak peeks at the end. So I'm really excited about that. But the content we're talking about is quilting for sampler quilts or quilts with more than one block. And sampler quilts or multi-block quilts are so cool because they're interesting, lots of different designs, but they can be a little challenging to piece because you can't really get normally into a routine sometimes, but definitely picking out quilting designs can be a little tricky, right? You got to figure out how to quilt one block and then you're like, great, now I got to figure out how to quilt the next block, and pretty soon decision fatigue can set in. So I'm going to give you some practical tips to help you pick designs, but just know that whatever you end up doing is going to look great. And if you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the chat. If I don't get to them now, you can leave them in the comments section too. I'll be sure to come back on later and answer those for you. So let's get right to the good stuff. So the sampler quilt example I'm going to use in this chat is from our Build a Quilt Block of the Month program. And so basically there's 10 different blocks and then 3 different layouts. And so we're going to kind of show you the blocks that we'll be talking about. But if you're participating in this year's Build a Quilt Block of the Month, this will look very, very familiar. But hopefully the practical tips will really help you get to where you need to go. So let's get right to the pictures. So Build a Quilt is a block of the month that's done through our shop, and what's kind of fun is you get to choose between 3 different colorways, and each of the colorways are fabric designs or fabric collections that I've designed. So for instance, these are the 10 blocks that we worked with, and this is the inked collection, which was my personal favorite. But we also had the Flag Day collection, which is more patriotic themed. That one was really fun to design. And then Stay Wild, which was Joni's love. She wanted something with sage green and real pretty. So the idea is that you can build a quilt by picking your colorway, and then you can also add optional layouts. So if you want, you can choose from 3 different optional layouts. And so those are the layouts I'm going to be talking about today, just because I already have that in my mind, so let's just talk about those quilts. But again, these tips can apply to any sampler quilt or any quilt that you're working on. So they're not specific to this, but this is just the examples that I'm using, okay? So let's dive into it. All right, when you're looking at your sampler quilt, the first thing I always try to do is establish some kind of background area, some kind of fabric that's repeating through the blocks that I can always quilt the same way. Usually that's going to be pretty obvious. Usually there's a background fabric, or maybe there's an element to each block that's similar. And by designating a design for that, it really kind of immediately takes a chunk of that away from you, of picking the designs. And so for this example, for the quilted blocks here, I went with a Swirl Meander. Now, the Swirl Meander is a great filler because it works in a lot of different spaces, and it can kind of fit into some of those little corners. But it just has a nice, lovely texture, so it's not going to really take away from the rest of the piecing. So right off the bat, I'm going to try to do that. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that I'm always going to stick to that rule, because just because I made the rule doesn't mean I can't break it, and we're going to see very quickly that I do that. But if it just takes one little thing, it makes it a little easier. So for each of these little quilted blocks, I have kind of the diagrams that will show you how I drew out the designs that I worked on. So it doesn't have to be swirls. It could be any repetitive design that you feel comfortable quilting. You need a little bit of a break as you're working through these different blocks. So making it something that's familiar will make it just so much easier on yourself. So swirls, a leafy meander, a stipple, anything that you can fill in different shapes, different areas, and be pretty comfortable with. So that's definitely going to help you out. Now, another thing, I would say the second thing I do the most, and you're going to see this a lot in this little sample, is find 2 or 3 types of designs that you can use in a lot of different ways. Okay, so what comes to mind is echoing. I love echoing like I did in the corners of this block. Echoing is going to highlight certain areas of your block or give you certain framing effects, and it just helps you fill in any really narrow areas or really weird kind of shaped areas. I always joke, but it's true. If I can't decide how to quilt a block, I usually start echoing something until designs start, the creativity starts popping in. So echoing is one I use a lot. Continuous curve. So in the center of this block, this would be an example of continuous curve. It's a line that curves continuously from one corner to the next. It's a great design to highlight points of your block that match, and it can also be quilted in different arrangements depending on where I need to go. Okay, we'll talk about that here in a second. So echoing, continuous curve, and then also dot to dot, and that's what I have kind of in the floral patches in the corners there. Dot to dot is simply creating geometric shapes using the sides of the block as a guide. So again, this is going to highlight your block, it's going to draw attention to certain areas, and it's just going to give you a little bit of versatility with your quilts. So I'm going to show you throughout some of these pictures a lot of different variations, but just sticking with that right there is going to help think, okay, how can I do a continuous curve in this area? And then you're going to come across different areas that maybe need a different design, like the wishbones that are in the sides here. I'll go to the diagram. And so just kind of keep some of your favorite designs in your back pocket, but if you're always focusing on just a few with variations, it's just going to give you a direction to head. So instead of always thinking like, oh, I don't know what to do this block, you can think, how can I use dot to dot quilting in this part of the block? So we're going to see examples of this, but really those two things will make it so much easier. The only other thing that I really take into account when I'm quilting any kind of quilt, but especially sampler quilts, is my piecing. I want to make sure that if I have great blocks that are pieced really well, I'm going to highlight those with quilting. If I have blocks that aren't pieced very well because I am not the best piecer, then I'm going to try different ways to take away from that. So I didn't actually quilt these blocks or piece these blocks. I quilted them. I didn't piece them. So they're pieced very perfectly, but I'll talk maybe about some examples where I could have changed that up. All right, so let's just focus on echoing for a second. So echoing is great, like I said, for those areas that are just a little thinner that you can't quite fit a design in, but you don't want to leave it unquilted. So really about an inch wide. I don't like to leave anything, like if it's an inch, I like to go ahead and quilt it, but there's not a lot that you can do in those areas. So adding some nice echo lines is going to make that easy. Now in this particular block, I used some ribbon candy in the brown print, and I'll show you the diagrams here in a second. But I want to show you that I did already break my rule about quilting the background fabric all the same. So I quilted that blue fabric as though it was the background with those swirls. But even though it's not the same print, it's still going to give me the same effect. So if you're looking at your quilt, you can definitely switch that up. But it's so much easier if you can just kind of establish that background area, and we can kind of see here. Another reason that this really helps is that you can use that background filler or that design to help you move around the block. So once you decide how you're going to quilt the block, and then you got to decide how you're going to work your way around the block, and sometimes that is almost as tricky. And so that's going to help you maneuver around if necessary. I'm also not afraid to use stitching in the ditch to get where I need to go. And I'm also going to pick designs that are going to help me either come back to where I'm at or move on, depending on what I want. But for now, you can see how I've used continuous curve in the center block, in the corner blocks, and even in those triangles, and then that nice swirl. But you can also use echoing to create secondary effects or pull out different parts of your block. So this particular block, again, I quilted swirls in the green fabric, even though it wasn't the background fabric, because I really wanted that star kind of shape to stand out. So echoing the sides of the triangle, not all three sides, but just the two sides that run into that center square, is going to make it, highlight that shape and kind of give me that star kind of shape. Don't obsess over it too much, because you know what, if you don't love how that one little part turns out, no worries, you've got several more blocks to work through. But just picking an area to echo, to highlight, and then putting swirls in the rest. And then you can see the dot to dot examples. Here, I'll go to the diagrams for you. The dot to dot examples that are used in the corners and even in that flying geese block. Now in the center, I'm actually going to go back. In the center, I did swirls, and you might think, well, it's the center of the quilt or center of the block. Maybe I could highlight it with some interesting quilting. The truth of the matter is that fabric is pretty busy, and you're not going to see the quilting anyway. Now, I designed it that way, so that's fine, but I don't want to take time to put a lot of effort in an area that you really can't see. Now, in this particular picture, I quilted with contrasting thread. I took it so that you could really see the quilting because that's the main point, but on an actual quilt, like, you really wouldn't notice that. So I'm gonna put my quilting investment in areas that you can actually see it. So if you have a busier fabric or, you know, a quilt made of busy fabrics, that's good news. You don't have to worry so much about stressing out about the quilting. Now, one question that came up in the type chat before I went live was, should you quilt each block separate or just do the same thing in each block? What would I suggest? And honestly, it depends. If you've watched, you know, several of my live chats, you know I say that all the time because it does depend. Do you like those quilt blocks? Do you want to show off one or two? Do you have time to quilt it? There's no wrong answer here. So when I'm doing each block, you know, separate, you could definitely just do a swirl over everything and highlight certain areas. Okay, so back to echoing. We can use echoing to highlight, you know, parts of our block. We can use it to fill in those narrower areas, but also as a way to highlight the quilting. So this particular quilt block, I should mention, I designed the blocks and the quilt patterns and the fabric. So if you don't like them, don't tell me because my feelings will get hurt. This block is made just out of half square triangles, but I loved the secondary kind of pattern that you get out of that. So I used echoing to kind of separate that out a bit, the corners or that little strip, and then added some ribbon candy because I knew that was a good, easy design to work with. Again, there's those swirls in a different part of the block, not that background fabric as normal, but then a little bit of dot-to-dot quilting in that pinwheel. Now, let's use our imagination. Let's pretend that I pieced this. I didn't. Joni pieced it, which is why it's perfect. In that pinwheel, in the center, where all those blocks come together so perfectly, if I had pieced this and it didn't work out like that, then I wouldn't have picked this design. So being mindful of where your lines are going, because that's where your attention is going to kind of be drawn. Now, for those of you that are watching this that are like, I'm just trying to figure out how to quilt without crying or peeing my pants, don't worry about this. But just know that once you get more comfortable with the quilting process, you can definitely use the quilting to highlight areas, draw attention to or away from things that you don't want to show off. So had I pieced this and it wasn't pieced very well, that whole center section would have got swirls quilted and I would have moved on. So I'm definitely looking at the piecing and trying to highlight the best parts and hide the worst parts. And here we can see a little bit of the diagrams. With all those swirls coming to the center and that dot to dot is really going to draw attention. So again, I'm going to make sure that I love how it turned out. Now this particular block isn't quilted. This is just an example of it, but to go back to the continuous curve and the dot to dot. So those versatile designs that you can use in a lot of different ways. And you have to kind of think, well, where do I want to go? How do I want to work my way around this block? It's not always going to work out perfectly, but every once in a while it does. So let's look at the diagrams I suggested with this. So first we see the swirls in the corners because that was the background fabric. Perfect. And then in those corners, those like kind of like, I don't know, the corner design, I did continuous curve. And I opted for that because I knew that it could fill in that area. It wasn't a small area, but it wasn't large either. That continuous curve can go from point to point and move me on to the other side. So as I'm working my way around, I can start from one side of that corner, quilt that continuous curve, and then use traveling to get to the center and then move on to my dot to dot. So as I'm picking those designs, it's mostly about where I'm going and how can I get there. If I'm looking at it and I'm like, oh, I need to come back to where I started, I'm going to do a different variation of the continuous curve. If you look in the very center of the block, that, you know, standard continuous curve is going to bring me back to where I started, and that's great if that's what I want. So I'm very mindful, or trying to be mindful, of how I need to work my way around the block. Now, I've quilted a couple times. I have a little bit of experience. I've actually quilted a lot. And so most of the time, I can quilt a whole block and then continue on continuously. But it just takes a little bit of forethought as you're working your way through. Plus, not being afraid to use stitching in the ditch to get to the next place. So if you look at those echo lines that are around that center square, kind of like the earlier block we saw, I'm using traveling to maneuver from one triangle to the next. Now, that means there's a little portion of that triangle, one side, that doesn't get stitched down. If you look at it really close, you can see it. So that means if you were to see it on the back, or if you were to notice, the whole line isn't quilted. I'm okay with that. Now, I guess I should preface this by saying don't do what I suggest and hope to win a ribbon in a quilt show, because that's probably not going to happen. But I'm using traveling to maneuver my way around the area, and I'm not so obsessed that I'm hitting every line. Now, you can wrestle with that and you can decide what you want to do, but that's kind of how I handle it. Another little rule I have, which now that I think about it, I'm not really OCD, but I have a lot of quilting rules for myself, so maybe there is a touch of that there. In general, if a block is pieced with different fabrics, I will quilt the fabrics differently, in general. So if we look at this particular block that was in the Build-A-Quilt, I would probably quilt the different fabrics differently instead of quilting the whole block as one. Now, we're going to see an example here in a little bit where that's not the case, but for the most part, if it's pieced with different fabric, I want to highlight that. So using dot to dot in the top and bottom triangles, using some echoing. Remember we talked about that's a great way to deal with those irregular areas. And then incorporating a different dot to dot motif in the center that looks a little bit more complex and kind of draws your eye to the center. But again, look, there's those swirls that are going to help me maneuver my way around the area and really smash down part of that block and just give me a second to like relax and catch up to what's going on. All right, so making secondary designs with your blocks is a really fun thing to do if you want to show off that particular area. So in these corners, I kind of struggled with how to quilt this because I did want to just quilt swirls in that background fabric, but it wasn't very wide and I knew I couldn't quite fit swirls in there. And so this one did stump me for a little bit. I'm like, oh, I don't know. So I decided to go with a dot to dot variation that creates a star around that block. And at one point when that line is touching that inner square, that's when I'll transfer into there and quilt the different design. So don't be afraid to kind of use those points on your block to create secondary designs with it. You might be surprised on what happens. But then in the strips or in the piecing or the center of the block, again, there's serpentine lines. We saw them a little bit earlier. I didn't really talk about them. A really good design that fits narrower areas and can fit kind of weirder shapes, and then more echoes. So echoing the smaller strips and then leaving the longer ones alone. Again, really just kind of thinking, I just did something curvy. What can I do that's opposite? I usually try to switch it up like that just because it points me in a direction, right? That's the only thing I need. I just need a suggestion and I can kind of run with it. And so here you can see a little bit of that. Again, I'm not hitting all those lines when I'm stitching in the ditch, but I'm okay with that. And just working my way and trying to get out as much as I get in and get out as much as I can. Of course, if you have to get stuck, you have to break thread. It's not the end of the world. Just continue on and get to the next one. All right, highlighting your favorite parts of the block. So those of you that did Build-A-Quilt this last year, we just finished our last meeting, or our last block. So we just wrapped it up, but this was block 9, and this one was made with templates. And so not everybody loved that, but what was fun about quilting or picking designs is you can highlight portions of the quilt that you want to show off. And I think what's fun, actually this block is a little different because it's missing something. I used the wrong graphic, but the idea is you can highlight those piecings or the piecing with it. So let's look at the diagram examples. So there's that kind of dot to dot around the outside. Again, keeping the quilting fairly simple in blocks, that I kind of want to pop out a little bit. And then echoing and then more dot to dot inside. And that repetition or that turn is going to kind of give us that kind of curl. But let's talk about this. One of the comments I heard with Build-A-Quilt was, oh, the center gets so bulky. If the center or an area of your quilt is bulky, you might want to kind of avoid it so that you don't have to run into that. So if I had actually, quilted this block and if I'd actually pieced it, I'm sure I'd have a lump in the center. I would probably do something slightly different. So don't be afraid to avoid areas that are going to give you trouble or to highlight different portions of that. And then of course there's those swirls in the background, taking a chance to do something a little bit easier and a little bit, repetitive. Okay, so then this block was one of my favorites. Is there something that stands out in the block to you? I could have you all look at this and you can all probably see something different that pops out. It's supposed to look kind of like a bear paw, but I love that outer ring, that kind of 2-inch outer ring that looks like it's going behind the bear paw. So if that's what stands out to me, then I'm going to quilt that continuously, or I'm going to highlight that area. And then of course, use dot to dot and swirls. So this is what I suggested, some wishbones. Wishbones are great for turning the corner, for filling in weird spaces, and even if you look at this and you're like, I don't think so. it's different when it's quilted. When you're drawing out your designs, you have to remember that you're not going to see the line like that. You're going to get that pretty texture. I had contemplated doing echo lines, but changed my mind once I thought about putting little bitty echo lines in amongst the points of that block. I said, that's going to take too long, so let's do something different. This is an example of using the quilting to combine the fabric. So if I kind of pop back over here, if we look at the bear paw, it's actually two different fabrics, right? It has a square and then the brown. I could have quilted those all different, and sometimes I would. But this time I decided it'd be awesome to join them together to kind of make that whole block kind of pop out and then have that wishbone kind of smash the rest of it down. Again, it's going to draw attention to the center, so hopefully this is pieced well, and then swirls in that background fabric. Now, this is a perfect example of picking designs based on your points or whatever. Again, this one was just a graphic, but if we look at the points of that bear paw, if those were chopped off, this would be the perfect design, right? Because all the lines are coming to the center. None of the lines on the points go all the way to a point. This would be a perfect example of trying to avoid if that were the case. So don't be afraid to change up your designs depending on how the piecing looks. All right, so now let's talk about the whole quilt. We kind of saw some blocks. I have 3 different layouts. That was from our last year's Build-A-Quilt. And I made quilting diagrams and ideas for both of them. I'm just going to talk about how you quilt in the context, how you quilt the quilt in the context of a sampler quilt. Well, usually quilts are laid out in a grid. Not all the time, and we'll see maybe an example of that. But when I step back and I look at the pattern, the first thing I'm going to try to think about is, what do I want to highlight here, right? Is there a secondary pattern that pops out? Is there a fabric that's my favorite? What kind of pokes out to me? So if I kind of zoom in, this is the layout number 1 for inked, and it's so crazy that the same quilt looks different in each colorway, but this particular one, what I really liked was how the fabric, to me, looks like it's making almost like a square behind it. Let me go back to the overall, you can see it. So where that teal is and then the center, I wanted just to kind of give that, I don't know, that separation, because I loved how they kind of came together. So to do that, I'm going to use echoing, right? We've seen this a lot. I'm going to echo the sides of the block, but when you're echoing, it doesn't have to be every side. So here, in those individual pieces, I'm echoing just the opposite corners, just to kind of help kind of give it that look, and then putting some swirls on the inside. When it comes to the inked fabric collection, it's so pretty. It's like inspired by calligraphy. It's teal, it's gray, it's one of my favorites. But the fabrics are pretty busy, and you can't see the quilting so much, so I'm going to do something that's easy for me. Now, these echo lines would help kind of separate those pieces, but you could definitely leave them out if you didn't, have time to do that. And then if you look at the fabrics, I mean, the border is so favorite. I'm such a gray and teal person. This is my love language right here. But in those busier borders or fabrics, again, just going with a design that's going to be easy for you to quilt. If you're not going to be able to see the quilting anyway, that's a perfect opportunity to practice a new design, or to just do something that feels familiar. And so here I suggested maybe alternating between swirls and leaves, because they're both fairly easy for me to quilt. They are a little bit different, so they'll give a little bit of separation between the two, but for the most part, all we're going to see is that beautiful, beautiful texture. So for busier fabrics, have at it. Now, in the strips around the block, they're about 2 inches. They don't have to turn the corner because I have those cornerstones, so I went with ribbon candy. I think ribbon candy is a great option for that size. And since I don't have to try turning the corner, I can just throw that in there. So again, busier fabrics. I'm going to try to keep it fairly simple. Use echoing to highlight parts of the block that I want to show off. So let's look at the quilt again. This is the whole quilt. And then you can see all the different diagrams there. So those echo lines will have a little bit of a different density, so it kind of helps separate it. But ultimately, the blocks are going to shine in this layout. And so if you're going to put a lot of effort into the blocks, keeping it fairly easy and the rest of the quilt is just going to be the way to go. I try to do something difficult or interesting in just parts of the quilt and then make it easy on myself and the rest. So especially as you're quilting, you're kind of probably working through block, you need just something a little bit easier in that background. All right, so this was the layout 2 option, and this is the version in Stay Wild. This is a little bit different, so it's not necessarily placed on a grid, so we're gonna have to kind of use the fabrics as a guide. But again, the fabrics are fairly busy. We're not gonna see a whole lot, and the blocks are made to shine in this particular quilt. So in it, the center is where you'd put your favorite block, right? And so the center, if we kind of zoom in, is the perfect way to kind of create some framing elements and kind of let you see the piecing of it. Well, you can probably guess what I'm going to say, right? It's the same stuff over and over again. But I'm going to use echoing to highlight the shape, use those wishbones because that's an easy design to quilt, and then dot to dot and continuous curve variations. That's just going to kind of help frame around that center block if that's my favorite part. If it wasn't my favorite part or I didn't love how it turned out, you know I'm not going to do this, right? I'm going to do something really interesting in the borders and hope everybody looks at the borders. But in this particular example, I wanted to show off the center. So echoing, great way to make areas easier to manage, and then a nice filler like swirls, swirl hooks, or even wishbones. Now, sometimes you'll deal with areas that are irregularly shaped. So this floral kind of fabric was really pretty, and I wanted to do something really cool in there, but I'm like, it's just a weird shape. So I decided to go with wood grain. Wood grain is nice because it goes from edge to edge, and it's only like this long. So great opportunity to practice a design if I'm not feeling super comfortable. And then on the above it, where it was blue, I did some echo lines. So again, I usually try to think contrast just because I'm easily, bored, but I'm easily amused. So after I quilt one design, I'll usually pick an opposite or a contrasting design. But wood grain is a great one, especially in an area that's only about 7 inches wide. Well, then I went and designed it so that it would have an inch border around the block. And again, that inch, it's just I don't want to leave it unquilted. And I could have done an echo line, but I decided to do a loopy meander, something nice and easy. And I think it's going to fit in there nicely, fill it in and then move on. However, you could definitely just leave it unquilted if you wanted it not quilted as densely as I did. Leaving it unquilted, however, or not putting anything in it is going to kind of draw attention to that. And if this is the frame around the block, I definitely want the block to show up. So I might not do anything too over the top in that area anyway. Now, how cute are these little bitty plus blocks? Okay, they're like 3 inches. So if you did this build a quilt layout, you probably were cussing me by the time you got to this point, but they're so cute. So for that area, I thought, man, wouldn't it be fun just to add a little bit of echoing and add some wishbone, just a little bit of something to help highlight those. Of course, you could, just do an all over. You could do some swirls around it, but I decided a little bit of custom quilting in the borders might not be too bad. And then leaving the blocks themselves unquilted, doing a little stitching in the seams, just tack it down and then having it pop out, I think would be a cute option. But if you get to it and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired of the borders, just do it all over. It's going to be fine. So I thought that would be a cool option. So again, here's the layout, and then I'll show you the quilting diagrams. It can be really overwhelming when you see all the diagrams, so try not to be too overwhelmed, or try not to be too overwhelmed when you're looking at the whole quilt either, right? You're going to take it chunk by chunk, step by step, and eventually it'll be finished. It's kind of like the saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So, all right, and then the third colorway for this last build a quilt, this was kind of the easier option, and a different layout, but still kind of on a grid. And what I loved about this was that the strips were the perfect width for practicing some different sashing designs. So if you have a quilt that has narrower strips, whether it's around a block, whether it's a lot of borders, kind of challenge yourself and think, what kind of different designs can I use in here? One thing I like to try to do if I'm working on a sampler quilt is, if possible, I can designate a design to a fabric. So when I see this fabric, I'm going to do this design, and that kind of helps get you one less thing to think about. But some of my favorites you've already seen. We've already seen the ribbon candy. We've already seen the serpentine lines. The swirl hook is another great one that I love, especially since I opted to do that as a filler above it. And then some echo lines. So again, with that narrower strip, I thought a little bit of separation might be nice. The only way I might not do that is if I was quilting this on my long arm. And if I did want to do that, I would turn the quilt sideways. I don't want to have to do an echo line that I have to advance the quilt for. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, just ignore me. But those of you on a long arm, loading a quilt like this sideways will be the way to go. So lots of strips. The more horizontal it is, the easier it's going to be. Now, when it comes to sashing around the blocks, though, this one kind of stumped me a bit because I'm thinking you can't necessarily quilt each sashing area separate because they kind of share one, right? So I'm like, so I decided to do something consistent, just do some echoed squares that just work my way around in there. So again, a little bit of contrast, something I hadn't done. I hadn't already done that in the quilt, so it kind of shows up a little bit, and it's also going to help me move my way around. This is just as simple as quilting a square that echoes in on itself and then moving off in the direction that you want to go. So nice and basic. So there's the quilts, and then there's the diagrams. So when it comes to, picking out all the different designs for your sampler quilt, the best, advice would be just get started. I think sometimes some quilters want to have the whole thing planned out and they want to know exactly what they're going to put where, but there's just too many moving parts to keep track of there. So pick one area and get started, and you'll be surprised how everything starts kind of flowing and the ideas start coming out. Again, kind of like I was joking, I'll do some echoing until something pops in my head, and usually something will. So I've been talking a lot about Build a Quilt because that just wrapped up, and Build a Quilt is a lot of fun. It's like our block of the month where we mail out the blocks, and I'm super excited because this next month, we'll be registering for the next Build a Quilt, and this will be our 5th one. So it's kind of crazy. 5 years we've been doing this, and I was going to show you a little sneak peek of the fabric collections for the next Build a Quilt. So that starts in November. Registration is next month, and this is just a sneak peek, but again, designed all the fabrics, so if you don't like them, don't tell me, because they already went to print, so it's too late to change it now. So like I said, you get to pick your choice of colorways, just kind of more the Build a Quilt option, and one of them is going to be Christmas themed. It's going to be Holly Jolly. And so I designed this to be bright and fun and wintry without being like over the top novelty. And so a nice blend of prints and colors, and so that will be one colorway option. The next one will be Stroll. So maybe you're not into Christmas, maybe you want something a little bit more masculine, something more navy and gold and grays. Really fun. I think this is going to be gorgeous. But I think my personal favorite is going to be Luxe. So I designed this to be soft, pinks and grays and blacks and whites, just something that was really, compared to the other two, totally different. And so 3 completely different fabric options for the Build a Quilt. And again, registration isn't going to start till next month. Well, actually later on this month, because it is October, isn't it? Or really close to it if it's not. So I'll definitely be sharing more information about that when it comes out, but this is just a little sneak peek of some of the fabrics. And this would be the end of my picture slideshow, but during the type chat before we started, a lot of people were like, oh, we want to see challenge stuff. So I do have a sneak peek of the next challenge panel, quilted and ready to go. We've had such a delay on fabric that I'm contemplating binding my panel. Isn't that weird? I never bind it, but I'm like, oh, I got nothing else to do. So the next challenge, I'm hoping I can announce it next week, guys. I'm hoping we get the fabric, fingers crossed, and then announce it and then start, November. But this is just a sneak peek of the panel. It's going to be on feathers. We're going to be talking about feathers. We're going to learn how to quilt them in blocks, in borders, how to fill in irregular areas. We're going to also touch just a little bit, if you want to, on thread painting. So if you look kind of close, you can see some different thread colors in the Swirl Meander. That's going to be an option if you want to. So really bright and fun and just happy. And this was kind of like the strike off, and so I cannot wait to show you the whole thing. I hope you like it as much as I do. So that is coming soon, I promise. I know. It feels like it's never going to get here, but it will soon. It will soon, and we'll be working on that. So just like the previous free motion challenges, it'll be 6 weeks long. We'll have a bonus border option, and then I'll have some smaller pillow panels too, in case you don't want to commit to such a big quilt. So a little bit of sneak peek of what's coming up. I've been very, very busy lately. I can't wait to be able to show it all out there. And another question that came up too was about rulers. Do I have any more rulers coming out? Yes, I do. I've got the prototypes for 3 new rulers. As soon as those go into production, I'll be able to show them to you. So very excited stuff happening. And I wouldn't get to do it if it weren't for you guys watching the videos and participating. So thank you so much for everything that you've done to help me be successful. And if you like this live chat or any of my videos or any of my free content, I hope you'll give the video a thumbs up, or I hope you leave a comment on there. That helps other quilters find it as well. Okay, so I'm sure there were some questions that came up. I'm going to look them over, so leave them in the comments, and I'll answer them in the comments later on this week. But I'll be back next week, next Thursday, for another live chat at 3 p.m. Central. To be determined topic, because if we get stuff in time, I'll be able to announce the challenge. If not, it'll be kind of a letdown, but I'll think of something interesting, and it'll still be worth it. So I hope you all have a great week, stay safe, and have a happy, happy quilting. Until next week, I'll see you later.